Most Americans have probably never thought much about Sri Lanka, but there's a good chance they've tasted it. The cinnamon in your coffee, the cinnamon in your apple pie, the cinnamon in your oatmeal on a cold winter morning. For centuries, much of the world's finest cinnamon came from a single island in the Indian Ocean, an island smaller than West Virginia, an island so valuable that Portuguese captains, Dutch merchants, and British governors spent centuries fighting over it. Today we call it Sri Lanka. For most of history, much of the world knew it as Ceylon, and while the island never became the center of a global empire, it did do something arguably more impressive. For over 300 years, it forced some of the world's most powerful empires to learn the same lesson over and over again. Landing on Sri Lanka was easy. Controlling it was another matter entirely. It's difficult for modern people to understand just how valuable these spices once were. Today, cinnamon sits quietly on grocery store shelves. A few dollars buys enough to last months. But before refrigeration, before global shipping, and before modern agriculture, spices were luxury goods. They flavored the food. They preserved the food. They signaled wealth. And among those spices, cinnamon occupied a special place. For centuries, merchants guarded its origins carefully. Stories circulated that cinnamon was collected from dangerous cliffs, guarded by giant birds. Others claimed it came from distant lands at the edge of the known world. The truth was much simpler. Much of the world's best cinnamon came from Sri Lanka. The island possessed the perfect climate for true cinnamon, and generations of Sinhalese harvesters developed techniques that transformed a simple tree bark into one of the most sought-after commodities on Earth. Long before Europeans arrived, Sri Lanka was already connected to global trade networks stretching across India, Arabia, Southeast Asia, and China. The island was not some forgotten corner of the world. It was already part of the world. The Europeans were simply arriving late. When Portuguese sailors arrived in the early 16th century, they saw opportunity. The coastlines offered ports, the trade routes offered wealth, and the cinnamon offered profits beyond imagination. At first, the Portuguese found allies among the competing kingdoms on the islands. But trade gradually became intervention. Intervention gradually became conquest. Before long, Portugal controlled much of the coast. From Lisbon, this must have looked like success. From Sri Lanka, the story was a little more complicated. Because while the Portuguese held ports and forts, the interior remained difficult to dominate. The Kingdom of Kandy occupied the mountainous center of the island. The terrain was brutal. Dense forest, steep hills, rains, disease, and narrow roads. The sort of country that could turn a military victory into a logistical nightmare. In 1594, the Portuguese launched a major expedition into Kandian territory. It ended in disaster at Danshur. Of the roughly 1,500 soldiers who marched into the highlands, only a small fraction returned. The Portuguese learned a lesson many future invaders would discover. Owning the coastline did not mean owning Sri Lanka. The Dutch East India Company arrived with a different strategy. Unlike the Portuguese, they were merchants first. Their goal was simple: control the cinnamon trade. They partnered with Kandy to drive the Portuguese from the island. And in many ways, they succeeded. By 1658, Portuguese power in Sri Lanka had largely collapsed. For a brief moment, it appeared the Dutch had solved the puzzle. Then they inherited it, because the same kingdom that helped remove the Portuguese had no intention of surrendering its independence. Relations deteriorated, wars followed. The Dutch controlled valuable coastal regions and exported enormous quantities of cinnamon. Yet, Kandy remained independent. At times, Kandian forces even destroyed cinnamon resources rather than allow them to enrich foreign powers. One gets the impression that the Dutch occasionally felt they had purchased the island, only to discover half of it had been left out of the transaction. When the British replaced the Dutch during the Napoleonic era, they inherited centuries of experience. Surely, this time would be different. Yet, even Britain, the largest empire in history, struggled with many of the same problems. Kandy remained independent. Military campaigns proved costly. The terrain remained difficult, and the politics remained complicated. Eventually, Britain succeeded where others had failed. In 1815, the Kandian Convention brought the kingdom under British control. But even then, the story didn't end. Rebellions followed, resistance continued. Conquest on paper and control in reality were often two different things. And perhaps that is the real lesson of Sri Lankan history. Not that the island was, say, unconquerable. It wasn't, but neither was it easily subdued. For centuries, local rulers adapted, resisted, negotiated, and survived against powers that often appeared overwhelmingly stronger. That alone is remarkable. Today, Sri Lanka rarely appears in discussions of world history. The island is often treated as a footnote. Yet for centuries, it sat at the crossroads of global trade. Its cinnamon flavored food from Europe to Asia. Its ports connected oceans. Its rulers shaped the decisions of empires. And traces of that history still sit quietly in American kitchens. Every autumn, millions of Americans sprinkle cinnamon into coffee, desserts, and holiday recipes. Most never even stop to think about where that spice came from, or about the generations of people who cultivated it, fought over it. But hidden inside that familiar scent is a story about trade, about empire, and about resistance, and about a small island in the Indian Ocean that mattered far more than most people realize. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing, because history is full of places like Sri Lanka, places that may rarely make the headlines, but quietly help shape the world we live in today.